Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
After a day of deliberation at Chequers, it is all clear. Theresa May's government is committed to taking Britain out of Europe, to some controls on immigration and to its own individual deal with the EU, not a copy of Norway or anyone else's. In short, the kind of outcome our European partners insist they will not be offering us. As Boris Johnson might say, we are still 100% for having our gatto and eating it. But how is that going to be achieved? Carl Dinnan tries to work out whether today's meeting actually reached any conclusions.
Theresa May led her ministers to Chequers today for an end-of-summer cabinet away day. And amidst the 16th century splendour of the Prime Minister's country residence, she made clear there was no question that Britain is on the way out of the European Union.
We'll be looking at the next steps that we need to take, but we'll also be looking at the opportunities that are now open to us. We must continue to be very clear that Brexit means Brexit, that we're going to make a success of it. That means there's no second referendum, no attempts to sort of stay in the EU by the back door. We're actually going to deliver on this.
But Brexit presents a particularly tricky puzzle for Mrs May. She must piece together Britain's access to the EU single market, along with restrictions on the freedom of movement and which EU regulations the UK wants to hold on to. At the same time, she has to keep on board senior pro-Europeans like Philip Hammond and Amber Rudd, and Brexiteers like Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, who are already disagreeing with one another. This evening, Number 10 said that ministers had agreed Brexit should mean additional controls on migration from the European Union, but also a positive outcome for those who want to trade with the single market. They also said there is no need for a parliamentary vote before triggering Article 50, the formal process of Britain leaving the EU. Avoiding Parliament may be wise, because it's not just the ministers meeting at Chequers who are divided over Brexit. Tory backbenchers also disagree on how much free market access Britain needs to negotiate.
We need that access to the single market. I also want us to have the free movement of labour, because I believe in the positive advantages of immigration.
We don't need to negotiate very much at all. We wish to take back control. We want to control our own borders, spend our own money, make our own laws outside the trade area.
At the Prime Minister's right hand today sat the Cabinet Secretary. His predecessor says this is one of the biggest jobs in living memory.
It involves negotiations covering all government departments. It will affect all of our lives, so this is probably one of the biggest challenges that the civil service and our government have faced certainly in my lifetime.
Returning to Downing Street this evening, that is the scale of the challenge facing Mrs May. And how well she meets it will likely define how her time in office will be remembered.
Well, as you saw there, Theresa May is back in Downing Street this evening, and Carl is also there. Carl, are we any closer to knowing how we will have our cake and eat it? Can we, and if so, how?
Well, it's going to be a very special British cake, we know that. It's going to be especially baked for this Brexit. It won't be like anyone else's deal. Now, the government wants, as I said in my report, to have some access, a positive outcome for those who want access to the single market, and some controls over freedom of movement. But the details are very vague, and it'll be the differences between those two things where the trouble comes. You've already heard Tory backbenchers today disagreeing on what the government should do next, and we all know how many Tory residents of this place have had problems and been brought low over Europe. So there's a long way to go before we're even in the position of having cake, never mind eating it. In fact, they're still drawing up the ingredients list now.
OK, Carl, thank you very much indeed.
Well, this morning, the best official line we had on our future place in Europe was yet another reiteration of the grand tautology, Brexit means Brexit. But that was before the Cabinet met at Chequers to talk things through. And after that, well, the line had barely moved on, to be honest. The official statement said, we're looking for controls on immigration, but we also want a good deal for trade. And if that seems less than clear, it's because there is a conflict between what kind of participation we have in the single market and how much control we have over our own rules and borders. It is the fundamental conflict because what the single market actually aspires to be is a vast borderless zone of unified standards and partially harmonised rules. For platinum access to that market, you have to give up some control. That's what it's all about. So how is the debate inside the Cabinet over what we should want from the EU? How is that panning out? Our political editor, Nick Watt, is with me. Nick, I gave some semblance of the, some sense of the official statements. What do you know about what went on in that meeting?
Well, there is a growing confidence in the Cabinet that the three Brexiteers, those are the ministers charged with taking the UK out of the EU, are going to reach an agreement, an agreed UK position within the coming months, and that will allow Theresa May early next year to trigger the formal process, that's Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, to take us out of the European Union. Now, Boris Johnson, David Davis and Liam Fox, they're not exactly bosom buddies, but Cabinet ministers were struck today by the way in which they were pulling in the same direction. They were clearly working together. They met last week and they're going to have regular meetings. And as one senior source said to me, they may loathe each other, but they sink or swim together.
Right, so they've got their ducks in a row, it seems. Now, the principles. What is the UK objective out of all of this? What do we know about where that's going?
Two important points from the Downing Street statement that you were mentioning there. Point number one is they're saying there will be controls on immigration from within the European Union when we leave, but they hope to do it in a way that will ensure that we can still trade in goods and services. Maybe that's wishful thinking. And the second big thing they're saying is that Theresa May is not looking for an off-the-shelf solution, the Norway option or the Turkish option. She's looking for what's being described as a bespoke option. This is a British deal. Again, maybe wishful thinking, but the thinking is that the UK is the world's fifth largest economy. We are somewhat larger than Turkey and Norway, and perhaps that'll give us some weight in those negotiations.
That in a way expresses the objectives. Where do they think this is going to end up? What is the deal going to look like? That's the crucial question.
Well, what I was really struck by today was a feeling that the UK in these negotiations should perhaps not get too fussed about access to the single market. Now, the Remain supporters are saying we've got to have as much access to the single market as possible, though that will be limited if there are controls on immigration. And essentially what I was hearing today is, look, don't forget that the single market largely covers trade in goods, not so much on services, which makes up the large part of the UK economy. And what some people have been saying to me is perhaps the UK could be clever in those negotiations. Perhaps it could spring a surprise by, for example, not sounding too fussed on the single market. And you remember we were talking last night about passporting rights. These are the ability to trade your financial services around the European Union. What I'm hearing tonight on that, developments on that, is that Philip Hammond is essentially saying our EU partners will assume that that will be number one on the Chancellor's list, on his shopping list in those negotiations. What if it's not? What if he doesn't make a big fuss of it? Maybe the UK could spring a surprise and find a clever and imaginative way of protecting financial services.
Without passporting.
Without passporting, yeah.
Nick, thank you very much. Well, it is clear that word of passporting is a central issue. It matters to financial services more than most because it's the right of companies based here to treat the whole of the EU or the EEA as their own patch with no new licensing or regulatory requirements. Is this crucial? Or can we swap the passport for a driving licence or some other similar document that has more or less the same effect? With me now, Vicky Price, economist, former advisor to the Department of Trade and Industry, and from Guernsey, that other great financial centre, venture capitalist John Moulton. Very good evening to you both. Vicky Price, first of all, explain passporting, financial services, the single market, what it means to be in it as opposed to sort of working from outside of it.
Well, the first thing to say is that, of course, financial services are very important for the UK economy. Yes, there may not be a perfect single market in financial services yet across the EU, but actually we benefit hugely from greater integration that is taking place. And if we're not part of this, then we're going to be losing out. But the most important thing to bear in mind, too, is that when you do have this passporting ability, what it actually means is that any firm, any financial services firm that settles in the UK or starts operating in the UK can then sell its services all across the EU without having to ask for permission, pass through new regulatory sort of tests, but of course it still has to comply with EU regulations, but it can do that freely from wherever it is. In other words, loads of firms that come from abroad, that come from the US, for example, or from Switzerland, set up here, can then basically operate like any EU.
So they can use London as a base for their financial services across the whole of the EU. John Moulton, that sounds pretty important, is it?
Yes, it is quite important. And clearly we want to be able to trade in financial services with Europe. There are ways to do that, the passporting system. There's a thing called equivalence, which is where the EU reckons that countries are following rules which are pretty much the same as their own, and they let them into the market on that basis. Places like Canada and Japan are actually trading in some financial services on that basis now. But it's likely that we'll have to go down that equivalent route if politically we aren't allowed to be part of the single market with the immigration controls that seem firmly attached to it.
But hang on.
Now, I live in a very prosperous financial services place, which does have immigration controls and does have essentially free trade into the EU.
Yeah, but I mean, John Moulton, the banks in London are not going to be very happy to think they're going to have the same access into Europe as the Japanese or the Americans, are they? That's quite a step back from where they've been, isn't it?
Not really. They thrived for a very long time with a highly competitive position with those countries. There's no reason why they shouldn't continue to do the same. The banks, I think, are actually now moving to a position where many of them don't want the passport. They prefer equivalence, because equivalence means that London can be a bit different than the rest of Europe, which would be an international advantage elsewhere, and perhaps less attractively would enable them to dodge the bonus cap.
Right. Vicky Price, now this is the disadvantage of the passport. The passport says we're British and single market and we all have a kind of minimum standard of regulation. If you do have this kind of equivalent or other arrangement, you can be operating on their rules there, but you can have different rules when you're operating in China. Now, is that good for the London as a financial centre?
Well, there are different rules depending on where you are operating is a fact in any case. But the interesting thing is that if we are trying to leave the single market because we think that it's actually very burdensome and has all sorts of regulations that we don't like, it's worth bearing in mind that actually the UK is considerably more tightly regulated in the financial sector than Europe is. And if anything, what we have been worrying about for quite some time is that we might be forced to lower our own regulatory environment in order to fit in with what goes on in Europe rather than the other way around.
I mean, John, you are speaking from Guernsey, of course. Guernsey is, if you like, an offshore centre. It's a very different one to London, isn't it? I just wonder whether the kind of the analogy of you're all right, it's doing okay, you're offshore and you can trade into Europe, whether that is going to work for something the size of London.
It's far from a perfect analogy. We are a lot smaller, but we do thrive. I don't think that the banks are going to be too worried about operating on this equivalence basis. The problem with equivalence and similar things is that they're determined by what is a very bureaucratic, slow system in Europe. Might take 3 years for us to be deemed equivalent, even though today we're obviously totally equivalent. We've got the same rules as the EU.
Right.
So it's not a perfect solution. Equivalence requires a lot of political will to make it happen quickly.
And Vicky Price, do you think the Europeans will kind of want London to be a big financial player for the residual EU, and they'll say, come on, we've got to make it work for London because they're our finance provider?
Well, we know full well that London is indeed the European centre, if you like, for the financial services, and we have such a huge attraction in terms of all sorts of foreign firms coming here, providing services for the whole of the EU. But we've already seen huge attempts by the French and others to try and get bits back from here by offering all sorts of incentives to firms to go and relocate in France, in Frankfurt and so on. I think that isn't going to stop at all. And I think we do need passporting, we do need to be part of this single market. And the interesting thing for me is that the Treasury, if indeed it is Hammond who pushes this, is the one department that has been incredibly good in negotiating deals for the UK in the financial sector, which other countries haven't been able to do.
I mean, John, I know you're quite optimistic about London. Is there somewhere else in Europe that can begin to nibble away at London's lead in financial services?
Begin to nibble, yes, but it's a really daunting task. London's got an incredibly strong concentration of talent. It's got a more sensible regulatory system than most of Europe operates with. It's really very popular. It's a nice place to live. It's in the right time zone. It's got lots going for it, and it's lived before having to operate outside other people's regulation to make money. The city got going in a big way in the 80s because it had got different regulation in the USA. Difference can be good.
Vicky Price, just more generally, the relevance or the weight put on a bespoke deal for Britain, a Brexit deal for Britain. I mean, you know, clearly Theresa May is not going to lift off the shelf Norway or Switzerland or Singapore or any of them. She's saying we'll negotiate our own. Is that a good strategy for an economy the size of ours as we approach this?
I think it all depends on what the Europeans think. Whether they do think that keeping the UK as close as they possibly can is a good thing for them or not. And we've already seen that confidence in Europe has declined because of the Brexit threat. So in a way, yes, they do need us. On the other hand, there's quite a lot of advantage they can have by just taking things over themselves. But I think we have to bear in mind that whatever arrangement we have in the end is going to be less good than what we've got now. And for me, negotiation will be the key. And we all know how difficult it's going to be. We all know how few people there are who can actually do it from the UK side and really know what the issues are in every aspect of these trading arrangements we have with them.
Yeah.
And what we do with the rest of the world, it's just not going to be an easy thing to do.
Now, there is one very interesting factor that is that the politics of this has led the government to say we have to have some control on immigration, but we do want as much trade as we can get. This is the conflict. The one that Theresa May hasn't talked about so much is the EU budget. I just wondered, John Moulton, whether you would approve of an idea that said, look, you guys in Europe have got a problem because quite a bit of your money is not going to be paid over to you from the UK anymore. But we, the UK, will bribe you. We'll just pay you some budget. I know that's a bit hard to swallow. We'll keep paying you for access to the single market on current terms. Would that be a good idea, finally? John Moulton.
Well, it's what Norway does. They put money in to remain a member without actually getting anything worthwhile back. So it's just a straight gift of cash for being in the single market. So on some terms, all deals are worth doing. I hope that isn't one deal we'll have to do.
OK. John Moulton, Vicky Price, thanks both very much. The writer Iain McEwan had his first work published in 1975, which, by coincidence, was the year of the first referendum on membership of the EU, or Common Market as it was. Things have not gone so well for Britain's relationship with the EU, which has upset Mr McEwan, who is, it's fair to say, a strong EU supporter. But things have gone well for him since 1975. He's written 15 or more major novels. One of them won the Man Booker. Many have been turned into films. One of those won an Oscar. And his latest novel is released tomorrow. It's an interesting one called Nutshell. It brings echoes of Hamlet to a murderous tale set in St John's Wood in North London. But the most striking feature is that the narrator is a rather erudite unborn child, a womb-bound witness to the drama. I sat down with Mr McEwan this morning to talk about the book, Brexit and Britain.
So here I am, upside down in a woman, arms patiently crossed, waiting and wondering who I'm in and what I'm in for. My eyes close nostalgically when I remember how I once drifted in my translucent body bag, floated dreamily in the bubble of my thoughts, through my private ocean in slow motion somersaults, colliding gently against the transparent bonds of my confinement.
Well, Iain McEwan, the book has this interesting conceit of the narrator being an unborn child. I mean, where did that come from?
A first line drifted into my head during a long, boring meeting, which I was required to wear an expression of attentive joy. And I sat on it for a couple of months and then decided I knew exactly who was speaking. In the meantime, I'd been reading Hamlet again. I dip into it now and then. And the two fused before I knew what I was doing. Having a fetus actually, it's very restrictive in a way. He can't see a thing. He has to listen very carefully to what's going on. But he can get into the most private situations. He hears all the pillow talk, of course. Sees his mother having an affair with his uncle from a very I was going to say privileged, rather less privileged point of view, but certainly intimate.
When the book goes to the States, obviously the issue of unborn children in America is a very hot issue and a difficult one.
I mean,
are you going to get
I'm already
reactions?
getting it. I mean, the Wall Street journalist says, that, well, this is clearly a pro-life novel. And I had to ask him to unwrap the question for me because I didn't understand what he was talking about.
So we shouldn't infer anything like that about you?
No, it didn't even cross my mind when I was writing it. And anyway, he gets born like many fetuses do. It's not about that. But in the States, opinions come in packages, in squadrons even.
Brexit, though, I know, wounded you deeply. You felt very, very bad after the referendum. You've written about how you, in a way, hoped it was just a bad dream.
Yeah.
Are you over it yet?
No, I'm still in denial. I still think it might not happen, or that it's impossible to happen. The triad, Fox, Davies, Johnson, will come back with a deal that is simply not going to acceptable to the Brexiters. We might be in something of a recession, and the mood of the country will change. And I asked to live in a parliamentary democracy. I don't want to be ruled by plebiscites. I think that running this matter on a small majority, when it impacts on every corner of our Constitution, our not only our laws, but our science, our whole sense of who we are in the world, was a huge mistake. And I think David Cameron will have to sit with an awkward historical reflection.
Do you blame him? I wonder, because you can point fingers, quite a lot of fingers of blame from your point of view, I would have thought.
Yeah, I suppose blame is hardly worth bothering with now. This is where we are. I think it was a huge mistake. I think we made a mistake, we who sit around thinking about these things, in not saying what is the status of this referendum and getting that clear. It apparently was advisory, unlike the AV referendum, which was binding on Parliament. If we'd gone into this referendum all telling each other this is only advisory and Parliament will take a decision, we might have been in a different place by now, and Parliament would be ready to make its view known.
Do you blame Jeremy Corbyn? Because a number on that side say he didn't.
He was a little feeble. I don't want to be ruled by plebiscites, and I don't want to live in a one-party state. I take a general view. I just wish the Labour Party would get themselves sorted out. The Parliamentary Labour Party would find a way of working with Corbyn or with whoever's going to be in front. I feel a growing impatience. We urgently need another voice in Parliament. We don't have one. We are now giving the government absolute free rein. They're in control of the argument.
Do you blame yourself and your class? Maybe it's my class. I mean, it's that metropolitan group who were a very easy target for the Brexit side of the campaign, of people who, if you like, seem to be rather comfortable, live rather well, and have a rather disconnected life from large parts of the country.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that. If you offer a referendum, you ask for a bloody nose, I think, and we got one. If you're not doing well by the status quo, why not vote for Brexit and see what comes up? I mean, I can see the logic of that.
I think in one interview you were quoted as saying, "What it's like to be a manual labourer just doesn't interest me enough." That's the problem. I wonder if that really is the problem in this country, that we were two cultures, two societies. Well, you don't get the other lot. They don't get you. They don't.
Yeah, you have to understand the context in which I say this.
Right.
That,
I don't want to.
My parents left school 14. I was the first to go to university, first to even stay on at school past 16. And I'm constantly being asked questions that no one asks Julian Barnes or James Fenton. It's why haven't I got more labourers and JCB drivers in my work? Well, I could have, but I don't. This is where I am. You can only judge a novelist by what he or she does, not by what they don't do. So I often sense a kind of a snobbery amongst my interviewers. What are you doing out of your class? Why are you here? Why are you taking up all our space? Why aren't you writing about your own class? Get back to where you came from. So I think it's their problem. I might well write about manual labour.
But
I was a dustman for Camden Council for 6 months. I'm absolutely free in that. I went to a wonderful state grammar school full of working class kids from central London. I feel very easy in the class system.
I've been